This Treaty of Sèvres was followed up by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, and you'll see here that the area was, in fact, given to Turkey. Okay, any questions about that? I apologize for having failed to assign this reading in time for you to have read it for the lecture. No questions? All right. Let's think about Africa then. I guess the take-home point from the Middle East being that those countries were not actually formally colonies in the full sense of colonialism, as per Bernstein, although in many ways the economic relations were secured in a similar fashion, right? Or rather, an alternate route to a similar outcome was secured, although it was accompanied by political problems and continuing struggles up to this day that were different in some ways from what happened in Africa. In any case, in Africa itself, there was a wave of independence, the end of colonial rule, beginning around 1950. So now we're fast-forwarding to the end of World War II. By this point, Europe is in ruins, right, from the war. The United States has emerged as the clear power in the world. The British and the French have been reduced to shadows of their former selves as far as global power is concerned. So the powers controlling most of Africa are in a very different position from what they had been before. African independence involved political self-determination at the national level, the restoration of political sovereignty to former colonies, in other words, the turning over of political control to the local populations, and thus the transformation from colonies to nation-states. Here you can see from 1885, you've got here the blue is the Belgians, the green is Portugal, Spain is in purple, Britain and France, you can't quite make out the difference here because the reproduction is not very good. But you see 1885, the sort of general situation at the moment of the Congo Act. By 1910, you've got this situation on the ground, the Belgians in the Belgian Congo, the Portuguese here in Angola, the British in this sort of corridor here, the French in West Africa. By 1950, you begin to see that you've got the actual boundaries of the different colonies delineated more precisely. And beginning in 1951 with Egypt, Sudan, Morocco, Tunisia in 56, Ghana, Guinea, South Africa in 57, 58, a whole long list in 1960, Nigeria, Senegal, Mali, Belgian Congo, French Congo, Ivory Coast, Upper Volta, Cameroon, Somalia, Dahomey, Mauritania, Madagascar, Niger, Chad, Togo, Gabon, and the Central African Republic all gained independence in 1960. Sierra Leone in 61, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Algeria in 62. And by 94, you see the last one being South Africa, in a sense. I guess Namibia actually belongs in that as well. Complete independence. What happened? Why did this happen? How did it play out? How did it affect the relations of power that had been established in the earlier colonial period? Some of these independence struggles involved very protracted, violent wars. Some of them did not. Some of them didn't involve wars between the local people and the colonial powers, but were followed by various kinds of struggles and wars among the previously colonized peoples as they fought over who would be in charge of the newly independent states. Here's another map depicting all of the countries in Africa with the dates at which they gained independence, with Liberia and Ethiopia and Western Sahara being different because they did not have to gain their independence. Ralph Austin is an economic historian specializing in Africa. He wrote a book called African Economic History in which he wrote that imperial partition, by which he means the activities that followed from the Congo Act, quote, destroyed the indigenous institutions which had controlled access to internal markets and resources, replacing them with structures linked directly to industrial Europe. And we've talked about that process already. Decolonization removed Europeans from formal control of these new structures, but did not dismantle the structures themselves. And if you've read Bernstein, he describes the ways, he provides a sort of analytic for thinking about this. He suggests that the imposition of capitalist social relations initially required a great deal of what he calls extra economic coercion, force, by a military or by various kinds of militarily equipped expeditionary forces, that kind of thing. It might later take the form of tribute requirements, such as we saw with rubber in the Belgian Congo, that you simply had to turn over a certain amount of product every month or every couple of weeks to the political powers, and if you didn't, they would arrest you or beat you or kill you. Those are extra economic coercion in the sense that they rely on something other than inducing you through some kind of contract to work for the capitalists or the agents in charge of trying to organize economic activity. Bernstein says, by the end of this process, the compulsion to sell your wage labor is basically economic in nature. You get to the point where you have no choice. You have no other way of making a living. You no longer own land to grow food on. You no longer own the tools necessary to make things yourselves. You need to work in order to live. That would be economic compulsion. And this is the framework that Marx describes and criticizes, right? That you are free to sell your labor. You are free in the sense that you're a citizen and you have rights. But that freedom, Marx suggests, is actually simply political in nature and does not extend into the economic realm where you are compelled by the need for food to sell your labor. Here we're seeing a similar kind of process at a colonial, national, even international scale. The system had been set up using extra economic coercion under colonialism, but it reached a point where the Europeans could remove themselves formally as the political powers in these colonies, and the system itself was still there. The structures themselves were still in place. And Africans could assume political power, could even assume control of the economy in large measure, and yet remain linked to Europe, linked to the industrial world for purposes of trade in ways that in many ways constrained what they could do. In the 1920s, there's some background here that this also comes from Austin. African exports grew very strongly, but they remained a small part of the world market as a whole. During a period of European prosperity and growth between the wars, with these European powers extracting wealth from Africa through the form of trade, and they generated enough money to make certain investments in the colonies, to build railroads, for example, to build roads, to build cities, to some degree to build other institutions associated with modern cities, whether we're talking about schools or grand ministry buildings, that kind of thing. The Depression of the 1930s cut off that prosperity and led many of the European powers to impose trade restrictions, protectionism, to try to prop up the economic circumstances both of their own home countries and of their colonies against the rival other powers. World War II provokes what Austin calls a welfare neo-mercantilism, in which they heightened those preferential terms of trade with their own colonies and began to make various kinds of further investments in social needs in the colonies, by this point responding, at least in some cases, to the demands of the native peoples themselves. The sense that this was, the gross inequalities and violations of basic democratic principles and human rights required greater investments and sort of concern for the local people. In the 1950s, in the aftermath of World War II, the European powers began to see their colonies in Africa as essentially no longer worth the trouble. They were investing instead in Europe, trying to rebuild Europe after World War II. They were now much more concerned with the world as a whole. The U.S. was more concerned with the Soviet Union. The European powers began to see these colonies as simply expensive and irrelevant to their larger economic well-being. So in Austin's words, by the 1960s, the metropoles, meaning the European central powers, had concluded that there were no serious economic costs involved in giving way to the political momentum of decolonization. So let's take a short break, and then we're going to come back and talk about independence cha-cha. I'll tell you what that is when we get back. 5 minutes.
Indépendance, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye. Odipanza, tcha-tcha, Tubakini. Otaberon, tcha-tcha, Bagageo. Odipanda, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye. Indépendance, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye. Odipanza, tcha-tcha, Tubakini. Otaberon, tcha-tcha, Bagageo. Odipanda, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye. Asorego, Nabago, Bayogani, Motomoko, Nakonaga, Nakarute, Balinani, Nafokome. Boigango, Kazabuko, Eumuma, Nakarondi, Tombe, Kanibatu, Boesanga, Mutakaza. Indépendance, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye. Odipanza, tcha-tcha, Tubakini. Otaberon, tcha-tcha, Bagageo. Odipanda, tcha-tcha, Tozumiye.
Okay, just to give you a taste of this. This is the band playing that song. This song is Independence Cha-Cha. It was written and produced in 1960 specifically to celebrate the independence of the Belgian Congo, the end of Belgian rule in the Congo. And I want to talk a little bit about music and its role in African independence, specifically in the Congo, because that's the music that I care about the most. But you can tell similar stories for other parts of Africa. there are many, many stories like this of the importance of recorded music, broadcast over the radio, put on LPs, which I guess barely exist anymore. You remember? You know what those are, right? And later on cassette tapes, which I suppose you probably also remember, even though they also don't hardly exist anymore. Combining instruments and musical forms from the Americas, Europe, technologies developed in the Americas and Europe with musical genres, practices, sounds, dances that were native to Africa. And they become sort of inextricably caught up in this process of trying to put together a nation that matches a state and mobilize support for these new independent nation states in Africa. The music gets caught up in the politics in ways that are extremely interesting. Now, any thoughts about that song that we just heard? Did you notice anything about it? Did it strike you as, have you heard this music before? Did it remind you of anything? Does it strike you as curious that the band looked like this? What do you notice about it? First of all, it's called African jazz. Did that sound like jazz to you? No. Did you have any idea that they were all wearing bow ties and tuxedos? Does the conga drum next to the guitar strike you as, and the stand-up bass strike you as interesting? No, perhaps this just isn't your music. I suppose you might not find this music as compelling as I do, and I apologize if I find it more compelling than maybe makes sense. But let's go back here for a second. We've talked about Leopoldville before, now known as Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was the capital of the Belgian Congo. It bore some similarities to other colonial capital cities. These were where virtually all the Europeans lived. These were the places where European life was sort of recreated as best it could be under the circumstances, with European schools and churches and big buildings and electricity, markets. It was where the economic activity coalesced as resources came in from the countryside and were shipped out to Europe, and goods came in from Europe and were distributed. But they concentrated inordinately in these cities. And they were melting pots, right? Peoples from all over the colony were drawn to the cities in various ways, whether under compulsion or on their own. And it was where progress seemed most sort of obvious and happening. It was where political power concentrated. During World War II, obviously the European powers were distracted, so to speak, but they continued to, they in fact drew significant numbers of soldiers from Africa. They conscripted Africans into their armies and created special units of Africans who fought in various parts of the war, various places, or who were redeployed and assigned tasks in other parts of Africa. And there was a tremendous movement of peoples and a great deal of a certain kind of upward mobility, actually, for Africans through the military. Even if they weren't getting rich, they were learning things and seeing places and getting access to things like music in ways that they hadn't had before. They were developing a sense of what else was going on in Africa and what the world looked like beyond the colonies in which they had grown up. World War II had a very strong effect on musical, sort of the intermixing of musical forms. A lot of African soldiers were actually conscripted because they were musicians, and they served as musicians in military bands. And they played music at various events for the white officer classes, that sort of thing. Musicians in some African cities were the only black people allowed to go into certain European neighborhoods and places, unless they, other than domestic helpers, right? Servants of various kinds. Nationalism and independence grew up in the aftermath of World War II and built, in many ways, on the African people who had come through the military or who had learned in their military experiences about the world and about ideas such as independence and democracy. I want to talk briefly about Patrice Lumumba, Mobutu Sese Seko, and then these two musicians, Joseph Kabasele, who was the head of African jazz, also known as Grand Kaye, and Franco, and the Tout-Puissant OK Jazz Band. If you don't speak French, that means the all-powerful OK Jazz Band. I want to listen to some of this music, talk about its importance in independence and subsequent events in Zaire, and just play you some of this music, I admit, because I like it. Now, when you get to the Soccer War, and you do the reading from Ryszard Kapuscinski's book, he will tell the story of how he got into the Belgian Congo in the immediate aftermath of independence. Have any of you heard of Kapuscinski before? He was a Polish journalist, and he was assigned by the Polish state news agency to cover third world coups, revolutions, uprisings, rebellions, independence struggles all over the world. So he's a state journalist for Poland during the Cold War, and he is sort of tasked with going out and reporting on these stories. And the story of his making his way into the Belgian Congo is itself rather interesting and dramatic. He has to sneak in. He can't get a visa to enter through sort of ordinary routes because he's coming from Poland. This is the Cold War. You don't just give a visa to a Polish journalist unless you're willing to risk the wrath of the U.S. government, right? Because that's the Soviet bloc, right? So anyway, you'll read in this, he has an encounter as he's driving overland from this part of Africa, trying to sneak his way in. He finally makes it to Kisangani. On the way, these dirt roads, this falling apart car, this local driver, these roadblocks with soldiers with guns stopping everybody, and you have no idea what they're going to do. And it turns out that he makes it through these roadblocks because frequently